Welcome to the Library Hour and our author interview. This week we're talking to Michael Dobbs, author of this book, King Richard, Nixon and Watergate, an American Tragedy. And Michael Dobbs has mined a lot of recently released material from the Nixon tapes to bring us a fly-on-the-wall account of the dramatic events as they unfolded in the Nixon presidency and introduce us to a colourful array of characters. The first question I asked Michael is to tell us about yourself and who you are not. Here's what he had to say.
Well, actually, I'm a seventh generation Australian. My great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother was on one of those convict ships in 1800. So I can trace my Australian ancestry back to 1800, actually a little earlier, because she married someone who was came in 1798 as a prison guard. But believe it or not, I've never been to Australia. I have an Australian passport, and I'd love to come someday, but I've never been to Aussie land.
Well, that's Australian royalty connection with the convict past.
Right. Well, we like to think so, certainly.
My reference to who you are not is due to the fact that you're often confused with your distant cousin and namesake, the English author Michael Dobbs.
Well, actually, that's the Irish side of my family, my father's side, and we can trace our ancestry back to the same little village in Ireland. We're very distantly related, even though we have the same name. The other Michael Dobbs is well known for being the author of The House of Cards, which became a smash TV series, I presume in Australia, but certainly in the UK and US. And he's now a member of the House of Lords in Britain. So sometimes I get addressed as Lord Dobbs, which is very flattering, but I'm not a lord at all.
Now, I counted 7 books that you've written. Is that right?
I think that sounds right.
The first was a trilogy dealing with the collapse of the Soviet Union, was it not?
Right. So I was a reporter for the Washington Post in Russia and Eastern Europe, and I witnessed the collapse of communism, and I wrote a book called Down with Big Brother, which is about the fall of the Soviet system. And I wrote 2 other books about the Cold War. One was 1 Minute to Midnight, which was about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the third was called 6 Months in 1945, which is about the period at the end of the Second World War from the Yalta Conference onward for 6 months, when the Cold War, the World War II partners, so the Soviet Union, the United States, and Britain become Cold War enemies. So I look at that period.
Now, the book we're talking about this morning, King Richard, Nixon and Watergate, an American Tragedy, it traces a period between Richard Nixon's second inauguration on January 20th, 1973, and his resignation on August the 8th, 1974. Nixon's special counsel, Chuck Colson, bemoaned the fact that Watergate was a catchy name which people would remember, but not what it was all about. And I'm inclined to agree with that. Could you remind the listener what it was about, please?
Right. Well, it's a very complicated story, and my book is not so much about Watergate, but the fall of the president and the unraveling of the presidency. There's a famous series of books called The Making of the President by Teddy White. Well, my book is really about the unmaking of the president. But just to remind listeners about Watergate itself, Nixon was running for re-election, and he wanted political intelligence against his Democratic rivals. And so his aides thought it would be a good idea somehow to break into the offices of the Democratic Party, which were in the Watergate here in Washington. So they organized this break-in, and they were caught red-handed. 5 burglars and their immediate handlers. But for many months, there was no connection was made, or it was difficult to make the connection between the burglars and the White House, or between the burglars and the president. They knew that the White House was involved somehow, but they couldn't connect it to Nixon's immediate circle. And really, Nixon was re-elected despite the Watergate controversy. And it was not until January of 1973, after his second inaugural, that the Nixon administration story, the White House story, really began to fall apart. And Nixon's aides begin turning on each other and eventually turning on the president. So that's the period that interests me.
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out that Nixon was never actually proven to have instigated the break-in, but rather the cover-up.
Right. There's little evidence that he actually ordered the break-in of the Watergate. He did order various other break-ins, which made it difficult for him just to shift responsibility for Watergate to other people, because it would quickly unravel all these other crimes that had been committed by the Nixon White House. But he didn't, as far as we know, order Watergate, and he didn't know about the break-in until after it occurred. So it was one of these things, in English history, there's a famous episode where the king, Henry II, says to his knights, "Who will rid me of this turbulent priest?" referring to the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was angering the king. And the knights go off and murder the Archbishop, Thomas à Becket, without the king knowing really what was happening and authorizing it. But he just gave a hint that he'd somehow like the Archbishop to be dealt with. And it was a little like that with Nixon and Watergate, that he hinted and he said that he wanted more intelligence against the Democrats, and then his underlings got the idea that they would plant microphones in the Democrat National Party headquarters.
You have to be careful what you say when you're in such a position.
Yeah, well, the White House, probably this is not just the White House, but, any administration or prime ministers in Australia, their administrations exist to fulfill the wishes of the leader, and sometimes you can get aides competing with each other to try to divine what the leader or the president wants and to carry out his wishes, and I think that's what they were doing in Nixon's case.
And that was made very clear in your book, that some of his aides, their whole lives revolved around their role, particularly Haldeman. But you've got a list of dramatic personae at the start of the book, and who were the key players?
Well, on the White House side, you mentioned Bob Haldeman, who was Nixon's chief of staff and was the man who was closest to him. Actually, Haldeman was known for imposing discipline on the White House, and he occasionally, refrained from carrying out Nixon's orders immediately. But there was another man called Chuck Colson, and Colson felt, the president's orders should be carried out immediately, or even his wishes. So, Colson was pretty much in charge of dirty tricks, and Nixon admired him. As he says at one point, Colson has the balls of a brass monkey. So, Colson considered himself Nixon's hatchet man and relished wreaking revenge on Nixon's enemies.
Nixon himself is the author of many books. I think I counted 19, including a book of poetry I was surprised to see. And there, of course, have been many books written about him. So why do you think there was another book was necessary?
Well, there have been lots of books about Watergate, the most famous of which is probably All the President's Men, by two people I used to know quite well at the Washington Post when I worked there, Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward. But all these books, first of all, most of them were written back in that period when there was much less information available than there is now. But secondly, most of them are written from the outside rather than from the inside. I mean, All the President's Men is a classic story of two journalists pursuing the president, and eventually the story ends with Nixon's resignation. But it's all, their experiences and them trying to figure out what is happening inside the White House. But really, with the release of all these tapes and other documents over the last 50 years, it's possible to tell the story from the inside. And that's what really fascinated me, to be able to follow Nixon around the White House from room to room. Because no other president is ever going to tape himself the way Nixon did, and probably no other world leader, come to that, is going to tape himself the way Nixon did, we're never going to get as intimate a look at a president or a world leader facing an existential crisis as we have with Nixon.
Nixon inherited this recording system from Lyndon Johnson and was reluctant to have it initially, and then he decided that it would be useful when he wrote his memoirs. Your account's based largely on these tapes, and you note in your book that an accurate transcript of 1 hour of tape required 100 hours of work by those who were tasked with that job. Can you describe the challenge this presented for you in reviewing tapes for your book?
Yeah. Well, actually, the Nixon tape recording system was different to Johnson's tape recording system, which was limited to telephone calls. And Nixon had that system ripped out, and it took him a couple of years before he decided to put in a system of his own. Okay. And the difference was that his system had no on-off switch. Johnson's system, Johnson started the tape recording. So Nixon's system was a system that just turned itself on whenever Nixon walked inside the room, and or picked up a telephone. As a result of which, some of the recordings are the quality is pretty good, particularly the telephone calls, but some of the recordings are very poor, such as the ones in the Oval Office and the Executive Office building next door and Camp David. And those, it takes a long time to decipher them. Some of them I had transcripts because courts made transcripts. But for the most part, I tended to use the conversations that were recorded on the telephone system, which are much easier to understand and are really more interesting, because at the end of the day, he would retire to his sort of hideaway in the White House residence and call people up from the Lincoln sitting room and ruminate about the events of the day. So they're actually the most interesting conversations.
And that's how you start the book off, with a conversation just after the inauguration. It's a very kind of intimate connection we have with Nixon through those descriptions. He could have destroyed the tapes, but he thought that he might use them in his defence when the whole thing was exposed. If we ignore the outcome of that decision, would you say that it was a reasonable strategy at the time?
Well, it was reasonable if you thought you could control the tapes, which Nixon did. I mean, he didn't, up until then, tape recordings had been considered the president's private property, and in fact, nobody knew that they existed. And so Nixon calculated that he would use these tapes for his memoirs and he would control access to them. That was, of course, a huge miscalculation, because they became evidence in criminal trials, and the case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court eventually, in July of 1973, ordered the release of the so-called smoking gun tape, which proved that Nixon had ordered the cover-up. But without that, Nixon could probably have got away with it.
This was the conversation that was recorded with John Dean when John Dean talked about Watergate being a cancer on the presidency.
That was one of the smoking gun tapes, but the tape that actually forced Nixon's resignation was another one earlier, a few days after the Watergate break-in, in which Nixon can be heard telling the CIA, or ordering Haldeman to tell the CIA to turn off the investigation, to call the FBI and turn off the investigation because it was allegedly a CIA matter. And that showed the president was directly involved in the obstruction of justice, and that triggered Nixon's resignation. The conversation with John Dean, which I describe in my book, was also very incriminating for Nixon, but it was a slightly different point. It showed that Nixon had approved the payment of hush money to the burglars, and he had even talked about raising perhaps more than $1 million to pay off the burglars to keep them quiet.
I just want to go to that passage because I think that much of the appeal of your book lies in the way that you draw on details to reconstruct some of those pivotal scenes. It really makes the reader feel that they are in the room. And so just going to that scene, it begins, well, sit down, said the president as John Dean entered the Oval Office, waving him to a chair in front of the massive desk. He talked to the White House counsel between the sides of his polished shoes, which were resting on the mahogany surface of the desk. He began with an attempt at joviality. Well, what's the Dean summary of the day about? Dean felt like an actor on stage for a big performance with a bad case of butterflies. Nixon had phoned him at home the previous night for an update on Watergate. I'm just interested to know how you reconstructed that. How do you know that Nixon had his feet on the desk and how Dean felt? Is that poetic license, right? Or are you?
No, nothing is poetic license in the book. Oh, there's always a basis for it. And the basis for that, well, first of all, the conversation was recorded, so we have the recording. But in terms of the president putting his feet on the desk and how he felt and how the president, how Dean felt, that comes from Dean's own memoir, Blind Ambition, in which he describes that scene and some of the things that occurred in the scene beyond just the simple fact of, what their conversation was about. So when I say that Nixon looked at him through his feet, which he'd got up on the desk, that is, I have a note in the endnote in the book that cites Dean's memoir as the source for that.
It's very characteristic of Nixon, wasn't it, that attitude?
You mean the attitude of what exactly?
The way he would sit with his feet up on the desk.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that we have photographs of Nixon sitting with his feet up on the desk, but that's not the reason why I included that detail in that particular scene. We know that he often put his feet up on the desk, but Dean said he put his feet up on the desk in this particular instance, and he wrote the book a short time after these events.
But why did you think it was an important detail to include there?
Well, of course, it's a trivial detail, but it gives readers a sense of being in the room. And that's what I tried to achieve, is that I tried to write the book the way a novelist might write a novel, and you try to include detail that brings the scene alive for readers, that they can imagine themselves in the room listening to this conversation.
No, and I think you succeed admirably. Another scene that sticks in my mind is captured in a photograph of Nixon and his family on a day when he was about to demand the resignation of Haldeman and Ehrlichman. Yep. Could you tell us a little bit about that picture? There are some wonderful pictures in the book, by the way.
Yeah. Well, that particular picture, you're referring to an incident that took place on Easter Sunday, when Nixon had gone down to his Florida house at Key Biscayne, which is near Miami. And he was having, there was strains in his family over this. He was, his family wanted to help him through this period, but he was find it very difficult to talk to them. And he was ignoring his wife, who wanted to help him. And, there was a lot of tension in the air, and the family atmosphere was incredibly strained. Anyway, they had they'd agreed to have a formal family portrait just before they went to church on Easter Sunday. So there are photographs of them all standing in a line with Easter bunnies. And then the photographer snapped a few photographs afterwards, which show the family all going off in their own different directions, and Pat Nixon sort of going off to one side of the garden and staring off into the distance, and Nixon with his head down and clasping his hands, by himself, and the daughters and their husbands looking in the direction of Pat Nixon, sort of obviously worried about her. Anyway, because all those photographs are now available, they weren't available at the time. I did find this photograph of, you had the official formal family photograph, and then account of that moment, describing how tense everything was in her family and how she and her mother were doing the best they could to reach through to to her father.
If you were a film director and you were, shooting this for a film, you would arrange the characters like that. Yeah, they're not looking at one another. The tension is palpable. Right. You must have combed through a lot of photographs.
I did. Actually, I collected the photographs during the COVID pandemic when the Nixon library was closed, and fortunately, they had put their entire database. They were able to send me, complete reels of photographs. They digitized their entire database. So I was able to go through the digitized contact prints and find photographs that hadn't been published before.
I particularly enjoyed your character portraits of the many colourful characters that populate the story, and I asked you in an email prior to this interview to select a passage to read before the interview, a passage to read during the interview, rather. What did you choose?
Well, I chose one about this extraordinary character, Martha Mitchell, who was the wife of the Attorney General and the head of Nixon's re-election campaign, John Mitchell, who was a very buttoned-up lawyer, and she was the opposite. She was known as the mouth of the South because she loved to talk to reporters, and she always had colorful things to say about Nixon's enemies, and then eventually she started revealing some of the scandalous things that were taking place in the Nixon administration. Anyway, Martha, she was also sort of rather an erratic person and drank a lot, was an alcoholic. So she would get on the phone with the reporters, and Mitchell and his security men tried to shut her up. Anyway, so this passage is about what happens when they tried to shut up Martha Mitchell. So learning that her former security man, James McCord, was one of the burglars, Martha wondered if he might also have bugged her private apartment in the Watergate. They lived in the Watergate themselves, the Mitchells. With the crazed wisdom of a Shakespeare fool, she prophesied, "This could land my husband in jail." I won't attempt the American Southern accent. Over the next few hours, she became increasingly abusive and hysterical, drowning several bottles of gin and whiskey. Her new bodyguard was under instructions from Mitchell to ensure that she didn't call any reporters. She nevertheless locked herself into her bedroom and made a call to Helen Thomas of United Press International. Hearing her on the phone, the bodyguard broke open the door and ripped the telephone line out of the wall in the middle of the conversation. He later pinned Martha down while a doctor forcibly removed her pants and plunged a needle into her thigh to administer tranquilizers. Martha fought back, smashing a glass door with her hand. She was taken to the local hospital where she received 6 stitches. When the reporter attempted to call her back, she was informed, Mrs. Mitchell is indisposed and cannot talk. That little sweetheart, said Mitchell when asked about the incident. She gets a little upset about politics, but she loves me and I love her, and that's what counts. Mitchell arranged for friends to escort his wife back across the continent on a red-eye flight. Eventually, Martha finds a way to complete her interrupted phone call with the reporter 2 days later. If you could see me, you wouldn't believe it, she told the reporter tearfully. I'm black and blue. I'm a political prisoner. Anyway, Martha Mitchell became quite, one of the sort of celebrities of Watergate, and one of the reasons it became a pop boiler for the American public and for people all around the world, actually.
Yeah, the scene, it's an incredible scene, but I think that more than anything, it illustrates the collateral damage that was, happening around Nixon and the Watergate case, and the impact it had on the lives of his aides and the people close to them.
Right, that's true. It destroyed a lot of people's lives, including Mitchell himself. He was sent to prison. His wife had pretty much a nervous breakdown. They later divorced. A number of people thought of committing suicide. I have a scene in the book where John Ehrlichman, Nixon's aide, is thinking of crashing Air Force One into the ground in order to, in a kind of mass murder suicide. He doesn't do it, but he thinks about it. And Nixon himself, prays on a couple of occasions that he won't wake up in the morning. So they're all under incredible strain. And this is a political tragedy, but it's also was a personal tragedy for many people.
Just looking at Nixon's legacy, he came from a very poor family and suffered the loss of two brothers in childhood. Is his impoverished background unique among presidents?
Well, it's not unique because, there's the old tradition of presidents being born in log cabins. I mean, Abraham Lincoln is one of them. Okay. Harry Truman also came from very poor background. But Nixon, he certainly, as they say in the US, he was born on home plate. He wasn't born on third base like Donald Trump. He, his parents were struggling, failed farmers, and then his father became a failed grocer. So everything Nixon achieved in his life, he achieved thanks to his own efforts. He made himself, and then he pretty much destroyed himself. So it's a story that's full of, pathos.
And this is why the title, King Richard Nixon, an American tragedy.
King Richard, partly that refers to, a reference to Shakespeare's tragedies, but it's also a reference to Nixon's mother, who named her children after the kings of England. The two that died from tuberculosis, they were both named after English kings, and Nixon himself was named after Richard the Lionheart, the Crusader king. So there's a sort of double meaning to the title.
How would you compare the case for impeachment for Nixon with other presidents like Clinton and Trump?
Well, in the case of Nixon, I don't think Nixon, he wasn't actually impeached. The Judiciary Committee voted for impeachment, but it never went to the full House. He resigned before he was impeached. But the only reason he was forced to resign was because of the existence of the tapes. If the tapes had not come to light and the Supreme Court had not successfully insisted on their release, at least the release of some of them, Nixon could probably have brazened it out. There wouldn't have been any way to tell who was telling the truth, him or his accuser, his principal accuser, John Dean. So, and this took 2 years in the case of Nixon. From the Watergate break-in to the resignation of the president was a process that took 2 years. So I mean, there were huge congressional investigations. Much more evidence was accumulated in the case of Nixon than either the cases of Trump or Clinton. So the evidence in the case of Nixon was much more damning. I mean, in the case of Trump, it was simply impossible to prove some of the things that the Democratic accusers claimed had happened. I mean, you can reasonably assume they had happened, but there was no, or the tapes were ambiguous, or the evidence was, the president could claim that the evidence was ambiguous.
How do you think history has judged him so far? Will your book contribute to his rehabilitation, or will it reinforce the tricky Dicky image?
Well, I think you can draw different conclusions from my book. I certainly I'm not soft on Nixon, because I include a lot of material that shows him in a bad light, but I also show him as a sort of human being with, real relationships, particularly with his family, and somebody who suffered greatly when he was forced to fire his two closest aides or demand their resignations. So it certainly creates a human picture of Nixon. And, I think Nixon's reputation has probably improved as a result by comparison with Donald Trump. I mean, Nixon never contested a US election, although he had reason actually to contest his election defeat to John F. Kennedy in 1960. But he accepted the result, even though it was much closer than the last election in the United States. So I do regard Nixon as within the mainstream of US presidents. I mean, he wasn't trying to bring the whole system down, as we saw with Trump. And he was also a very creative and inventive foreign policy thinker who knew a lot about American history, had a very sophisticated understanding of foreign policy. So he was a substantive president, a much more serious president, in my view, than our most recent president.
I'd just like to wrap up by making a less lofty literary allusion to your Shakespearean one. My opinion of Nixon and his everyman persona, I guess, to me is somehow expressed in Frank Sinatra's song "That's Life," and I'd just like to quote from it. "I've been a puppet, a pauper, a pirate, a poet, a pawn and a king. Been up and down and over and out, and I know one thing. Each time I find myself flat on my face, I pick myself up and get back in the race." He was a fan of Sinatra, and Sinatra performed at the White House for him. Have you ever sort of considered how those lyrics might describe him, particularly the reference to a poet, a pawn and a king?
Right. Well, that's true. But what most resonated with me from that quote was the last line, "I pick myself up and get back in the race." I think that describes Nixon to a T. He wrote himself, "A man is not finished when he's defeated, he's finished when he quits." And I think this is, Nixon's greatest quality was, from the point of view of being a politician, was his indestructibility. I mean, he was knocked down many times and he kept on getting up again. And you see that, and I think this is what makes this story different to the standard Shakespearean tragedy, which is that the king doesn't die, or the hero doesn't die at the end. He reinvents himself. And that's something that's very American. And, Nixon was adept at doing. He kept on bouncing back from defeat and reinventing himself. And whether you like him or not, that's a quality that certainly defines Nixon and in a way defines America.
Michael, thanks very much for speaking with us this morning. I've enjoyed your book immensely and recommend it wholeheartedly to listeners.
Well, thank you very much. It was good to chat with you too.